What the scariest true story you know? A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or two later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry act. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. My brother was a police officer. He had a call to check on the welfare of a mother who had not showed up for work. She had died on the sofa and her little toddler brought the little diaper pad and laid down next to her, and died of dehydration. The little kid had opened the lower cabinets and drawers in the kitchen looking for food. He still cries about it, and he's not the crying kind. When I was 7 I was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard and a beat up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I did indeed know how. "Yes," I responded. "Give me a hand real quick," he said. So I started walking towards his truck. At the last second my mom called out to me from the garage and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, the truck start, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day. About 30 years later I jump up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and it hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the F? What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory? I was shaking for at least a half hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17 yo. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend and she had the house to herself. Went about her business having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely in the 2000s. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel onto ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, two former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in the 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of worked against them, as much of the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice and, particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last 4 years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of 4 years meant the entire crews of both ships was slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia and general mental deterioration, combined with already present tuberculosis that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2-3 years stuck in the ice, The captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try and hike out together to the nearest trading outpost in Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey, their remains discovered by local Inuits and Etselik tribes, who describe desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents and even human body parts in cook pots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. Dan Simmons wrote a historical fantasy book about this. It's fantastic. The Terror. He took the real events and used them as the background to create a horror story from. It's so well written that when reading it I felt the desire to get under blankets against the cold and drink OJ to ward off scurvy. I read a story recently about Paulette Gabarra, a 4-year-old child who went missing from her room in 2010. Her parents immediately notified authorities and started a social media campaign to find Paulette. Paulette's room was searched multiple times and used by her parents to do media interviews. Here's the terrifying part. Paulette was found dead 10 days later, in her bed. She had wedged herself between the mattress and the footboard and suffocated. Here is her bed before they found her. It's insane looking at that picture and knowing she is there and no one had found her. Here is an article for anyone interested. The story that inspired Candyman is pretty creepy. A woman in a Chicago apartment was murdered by some drug dealer who lived next door. How did he get into her apartment? Through a hole behind her bathroom cabinet mirror. I grew up on a farm in the Texas Panhandle, the boxy part on top, in a house a few miles from ours. Most of the members of a family were randomly murdered. One girl, 10 years old at the time, survived by pretending to be dead. The aerial Castro kidnappings. Basically, a man living in Cleveland, Ohio, kidnapped 3 young girls named Gina D. Jesus, Amanda Berry and Michelle Knight and kept them prisoner in his home in Tremont for 12 years. He even had a child with one, but more often than not, if one got pregnant, he would just beat them until they miscarried. Eventually, one escaped with the help of a man named Charles Ramsey who contacted police. Castro was then arrested and the other 2 girls were saved. If that's not bad enough, the mother of D. Jesus went on a talk show with semi-renowned and infamous psychic Sylvia Brown, who told her that her daughter had died in Japan after being sold into sex slavery by Vietnamese human traffickers. The blue ring octopus has a venom that causes paralysis, causing people to die of cardiac arrest or because of hypoxia. There is no antidote. The cure is CPR or life support for the hour or so it takes for the venom to leave the body. There was a man who was bitten by a blue ring octopus. As the lifeguard was performing CPR, he was lying on his back on the beach, facing the sky, eyes frozen open, unable to close his eyes or communicate with the others. He lied there as the sun slowly burnt out his retinas. He became permanently blind. The Broken Arrow killings. 2 brothers brutally murdered their entire family. At one point their young, 5 or 6-ish, siblings were hiding in the bathroom when one of the brothers pretended to need their help. Soon as they let him in, he killed them. One of their last words were, "Please don't kill me, I love you." Horrifying story. The Nutty Putty Cave incident. A spelunker got stuck upside down in a narrow cave for 26 hours. Crews tried to pull him out with pulleys, but had to be careful not to break his legs, because that could be fatal with the circumstances he was in. Rescuers even almost dislodged him, only for an anchor to fail at the last second, plunging him back into the crevice. He eventually died, and they sealed the cave shut with him inside. I read about this a few weeks ago. I had heart palpitations just thinking about being stuck in that hole. Just scary as hell. Thinking about it now makes my hands sweaty. I never understood the fascination with diving into such tight and dangerous spaces. The murder of the Green family. A deranged pedo named Joseph Edward Duncan was already on the run from the cops for a past sexual assault. He was incredibly charming and manipulative, and was truly pure evil. He camped outside a family's rural home, unseen by them. He picked it out after driving past it and seeing children's toys outside. He watched them from afar, got to know their routine with the intent of kidnapping the children. 10-year-old Dylan, 8-year-old Shasta. Jed found the lock on the door was broken, entered the home in the middle of the night and tied up the mom, dad and teenage son. He put Shasta and Dylan in his car and killed the rest of the family with a hammer. He traveled around various campsites and cabins with Shasta and Dylan captive, sexually abusing, torturing and raping them. He eventually shot Dylan, but Shasta talked him out of killing her. Jed ended up telling her she taught him how to love. The scariest part is a CCTV footage of Jed and Shasta at a gas station, because you could easily believe they were just a normal dad and a grumpy daughter if you were an onlooker. https /bzttd mic door. Eventually, he took her to a diner where he was finally apprehended when a waitress noticed something was up, and Shasta was saved after 7 weeks in his clutches. As he was dragged away, he called to her, "Promise me you'll visit me in prison," and she said she would. I don't know if she ever did. Jed was put on death row and found to be guilty of 3 previous child murders. He died a few months ago from cancer, but the worst part of it all is how horrible Shasta's life has been afterwards. Drug addiction, in and out of jail, losing her children, etc. Just the most horrifying story ever. One day, this kid gets taken to school by his stepmom for a big science fair. Things go well. He has his picture taken. Stepmom watches him go down the hallway to class, and he's never seen again. Joseph Fritzl imprisoned his daughter in a secret room in his basement for 24 years, and fathered 6-7 children on her. He actually effing planned the whole thing 6 years in advance, got a building permit and built her an escapable apartment-like prison underneath his house. He drove miles to dispose of trash and do shopping for the imprisoned and not be recognized while doing so. Seriously effed up. He was only found out because one of the children he fathered got seriously ill and had to be taken to the hospital after spending her whole 19-year-long life underground. He claimed that his daughter, Elizabeth, thought to have been abducted by a cult, dropped the granddaughter off at his house because she wasn't able to take care of the sick young woman. Doctors found the story fishy, involved authorities and demanded to speak to Elizabeth in order to find out what her daughter was suffering from. I'm on my phone, so please forgive my formatting. In the 80s there was a Mexican cult led by an American named Adolfo Constanzo. They used to kidnap random people from tourist towns and nearby cities and perform human sacrifice on them in their rural Mexican desert compound, usually torturing in elaborate rituals for hours or days before finally letting them die. These rituals included vivisections, castrations, eyeball removal, tongue removal, teeth pulling, skin flaying, hanging, etc. They used amphetamines and coke to force the victim to stay awake during the torture and not pass out from shock. The cult believed the more pain and fear they could generate in the sacrifice victim, the more powerful the body parts would be as ritual trinkets and also for food for the cult's nganga, which is a large ritual cauldron used to store bones, blood, meat, and other valuable items that the cult believed gave them power. They used to make staves out of wired together spinal columns, and they would often eat the victim's eyeballs during the rituals. They are believed to have kidnapped and sacrificed over 26 people to their nganga in their 3 years that they were active from 1986 to 1989. The leader committed suicide when the police showed up at their compound. They arrested 14 cult members, but most people believe there were at least a dozen more that escaped and are still out there. Yo, what the F? There was a cartel that kidnapped entire buses and made the people fight to the death. My maternal grandfather, in the days before hot water on tap, put a big pot on to boil before leaving for work for his wife and kids to bathe with. The pot boiled over and extinguished the flame, and he returned to find them dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. My mother was of his second marriage. HG, the lone survivor of what would later be called the Wichita Massacre. She was a 25-year-old elementary school teacher at the time, and had gone to the triplex where her boyfriend, Jason Beffert, a science teacher, lived with 2 roommates, Brad Haker, a chemist, and Aaron Sander, who was studying to become a priest. HG settled in front of a TV and began grading papers when Heather Muller, a friend of Aaron Sanders, showed up. The 5 friends watched TV and eventually retired to their various bedrooms. HG was woken from her sleep shortly after by loud voices and the bedroom door being kicked open. The 2 perps eventually gathered all of the persons in the residence and herded them to the bedroom and ordered them, at gunpoint, to strip. Many atrocities occurred as hours went by, but in the end HG, after being shot in the head in a frozen soccer field, ran naked for almost a mile to find a house with Christmas lights. It was mid-December, to beg for assistance. The USS West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside the ship. Turns out that these noises were people. They were trapped in a room to where they couldn't be broken out of it because of the water that would seep in and drown them, and they couldn't be brought out from the top because of the gases that lingered there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of these 3 men were found. The other things that remained were empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from the 7th of December to the 23rd of December. This means they were trapped in there for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out, and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved. And they had the fear of drowning in the tight little compartment of the ship. They had to face the realization that you are going to die and the psychological torture that goes along with it. I don't know if it's scary, but when I was younger, me and my twin brother would help our friend do his paper route. One summer we could smell something gross coming from one of the houses. We all didn't think anything of it until 3 days later when the smell was reaching down the driveway. We went to the back door where he normally dropped the paper and noticed it was open. We went in and looked around the house and found the owner dead. He had died of a heart attack and his cats were eating him. It seems to happen a lot. Yes, it does. My grandfather's brother was an old man that lived alone. One afternoon his neighbors started calling my family because there was a strange smell coming from the house. We all imagined what had happened, as I was in my 20s and apparently the only one that could get inside the house after jumping his backyard fence. We didn't have the keys from his house. I was assigned the task of going inside. As soon as I reached his bedroom, I noticed his corpse lying near the bed. The smell was awful. I remember turning my side to see the bedroom, and as I was rolling my head, I kept my head going until I faced the way out again. That was enough. Took the meds, too many attempts to remove his body and take it to the morgue. My father told me they were puking a lot. Apparently the body had been laying there for quite a few days and it was starting to decompose. In 1949, Timothy Evans was wrongly executed for murdering his pregnant wife and daughter. The actual murderer, John Christie, was a prosecution witness at Evans' trial. After Evans was executed, Christie went on to kill 4 more people. Had the police handled the forensic evidence properly, Christie would have been caught when they were investigating Evans, and those 4 people would still be alive. The government didn't acknowledge that Evans was innocent until 2004. A guy in a sinking ship found an oxygen bubble and only drank a sip of Diet Coke every 7 hours. He was rescued after 60 hours after being under constant danger from drowning and even sharks. I've heard about this one. After his rescue, didn't he need to sit in isolation for a few days as pressure was released? Yep. Being that deep for so long would have caused the bends and killed him if he ascended too quickly. So I think he was put in a decompression chamber for 2 or 3 days. Sharks are notoriously fans of Pepsi. They saw the diet and left him alone. His name is Harris Nokeen. You can watch his rescue video here. I worked in forensic medicine. My boss had to perform an autopsy on a chopped off head that was found by 2 completely traumatized children. The autopsy itself took 7 hours because the person had over 56 different injuries to the head. This was posted here the last time. The story is about a woman who was found pushing her baby had been dead on a swing for 2 days. The baby died from hypothermia and dehydration. She was found not criminally negligent due to schizophrenia. Here is the article. Absolutely horrifying. The Raina Mariquin story. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s. Got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. A woman 2 blocks away from my house had multiple children and was pregnant again. I heard my mom talking about her. She has more kids than me and she about to have another. She's crazy. Mom had 6 of us. One day the lady wasn't pregnant anymore, and there was no baby to be found. Someone told the police about it. The police questioned them and raided their home. They found the newborn dead and stuffed in the freezer. This isn't a scary story. but it's spooky and always captured my imagination. One day a bunch of, I think they were police in training, explored some of the catacombs under Paris. A lot of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. They continued going and saw there were speakers mounted on the wall, playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras. They continued. They came into this huge opening and found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated. It had projectors and a mix of old and new movies. It even had electricity running and 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day they returned to try and investigate further with more experienced officers. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out. All the furniture was gone. All that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who was there. Alison Boter. On the 18th of December 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Alison Boter was abducted, read, stabbed and left for dead by Franz Dutoit and Thunes Kruger. They slashed her throat 17 times, so deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand she had to hold in the organ spilling from her stomach, where she had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle the knife thrusts had missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There is a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called Alison, worth the watch but might be traumatic for some viewers. Trailer for Alison. I grew up in Surrey and this story was told to me at a very young age. I was shocked as to what happened to her, yet in awe of what she accomplished. She gave a speech at my previous company's conference one year and I got to meet her. Absolutely phenomenal woman and I am honored I was able to chat to her for a few minutes. The story of the Lake Ness disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. I saw an interview of one of the first people at the scene afterwards. He said it was very still and quiet because even the insects were all killed. A lesser known fact, even though many people died in this situation, it led scientists to discover another lake with almost the exact same situation occurring. The difference was that the other lake was near a relatively large city. A CO2 bubble forming at the bottom of the lake would have almost certainly been burst by an earthquake. Thankfully, since scientists were able to find it quick enough, they created a system that could slowly vent that CO2 and prevent many more people from dying. I could not speak. I became unconscious. I could not open my mouth because then I smelled something terrible. I heard my daughter snoring in a terrible way, very abnormal. When crossing to my daughter's bed, I collapsed and fell. I was there till 9 o'clock in the morning of Friday, the next day, until a friend of mine came and knocked at my door. I was surprised to see that my trousers were red, had some stains like honey. I saw some starchy mess on my body. My arms had some wounds. I didn't really know how I got these wounds. I opened the door. I wanted to speak. My breath would not come out. My daughter was already dead. I went into my daughter's bed, thinking that she was still sleeping. I slept till it was 4:30 in the afternoon, on Friday, the same day. Then, I managed to go over to my neighbors' houses. They were all dead. I decided to leave, because most of my family was in one. I got my motorcycle. A friend whose father had died left with me, for one. As I rode through Nice I didn't see any sign of any living thing. When I got to one, I was unable to walk, even to talk. My body was completely weak. I remember reading ages ago about a guy who was in the military. He got back home after a tour of duty to find his wife and 2 kids dead. They lived in a remote location. Turned out the mom had a sudden heart attack or stroke or something and the 2 little kids had died of starvation or dehydration as they were too young to care for themselves. Not exactly a ghost story, but as a parent that scares the shit out of me. Reminds me of a story. Dad, mom, 3 kids decide they want to spend a weekend away at their cabin, but dad has to work on Friday. They decide mom kids will go on ahead without him and he will meet them at the cabin Saturday morning. Gigantic storm rolls through and suddenly a terrifying tornado touches down. It destroys part of town, including the neighborhood where the family lives. Dad is a firefighter so they are swamped with rescues but dad is happy his family is safe at the cabin. His truck finish their active calls and decide to take a drive around town to look for anyone needed help and see all the damage, and they drive down the family's street. The house is half destroyed, but more importantly, Dad spots Mom's car in the driveway. Mom, all 3 kids died because they had decided to wait for Dad as a surprise. There was over 25 deaths in total from the tornado. Dad ended up committing suicide a year or so later. The story was told to my dad when he went through first responder counseling by the firefighter Dad's old co-worker.